It's time to tackle the big question. Is Israel an apartheid state? This is a question that comes up all the time, and supporters of the State of Israel argue that it is impossible that Israel is an apartheid state because of the 2 million Palestinians who live as Israelis within Israel. They also reference various Arab Israelis who are in parliament or who are top judges in Israeli courts as a rebuttal to the fact that Israel is an apartheid regime. But before we unpack all of this, I have a request to make. This channel was set up with the sole purpose of educating people about the propaganda and the false narrative that exists around the Palestinian story. My aim is to be a voice for justice and the emancipation of the Palestinian people, and ultimately peace for everyone in the region. If you support this initiative, please subscribe to this channel and amplify our voice to push us forward. Every click of this subscription button helps elevate the cause for Palestinians who, without all of us speaking out, would be voiceless and alone. If every one of you guys just clicks this subscribe button right now, we will be way past our first objective of 1,000 subscriptions. Better yet, if you could get a friend or a family member to do the same, we would fly past that. I'm really grateful for your support. Now, back to apartheid. As always, let's set the scene and let's establish the context first. The patch of land we're talking about is that of historic Palestine. Within this area, there is the State of Israel, which makes up the majority of the land, and we also have Palestinian territories of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. There are also other occupied territories such as the Golan Heights of Syria and the Sheba Farms of Lebanon, but for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to park these territories to one side for the time being. As a starting point, let's briefly establish exactly what apartheid actually is. Apartheid is an Afrikaans word that means separation, and the term, as we know, is synonymous with the oppressive racist regime in South Africa. International consensus has separated it from the specific and very narrow paradigm of the South African oppression and has adopted it more broadly to refer to other forms of systematic, racially discriminative systems of legislation. The concept of apartheid is now well established in international law, and the definitions were firmly enshrined in two key conventions. The International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, that took place in 1965, and the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crimes of Apartheid. This took place in 1973. It's this latter convention which establishes the law of apartheid, and in Article 2 there are 6 components to the crime which can be summarised into 3 main categories. 1. The intent to maintain domination by one racial group over another. 2. A context of systematic oppression by the dominant group over the marginalised group. And 3. Inhumane acts such as forcible transfer and expropriation of land and property. Apartheid doesn't have to resemble that of South Africa. A system just has to meet the threshold set out in Article 2 of the Convention for it to be deemed an apartheid structure. Okay, so let's consider exactly what prominent voices have used the term apartheid when discussing Israel. Let's start with some individuals. Tamir Pardo was one of the head of Israel's secret services, also known as Mossad. He was the intelligence chief under Netanyahu up to 2016, and he explicitly said that Israel was imposing an apartheid on Palestinians. He was very explicit. Someone else from within the Israeli state apparatus is Amiram Levin, who is a former commander of the IDF, the Israeli Armed Forces, and he described Israel as implementing total apartheid and confessed that the Israeli army were committing war crimes, even comparing the depravity of the system with that of Nazi Germany. Various Israeli leaders of the past warned that Israel was moving dangerously towards apartheid if policies of occupation and settlement continued, which they do to this day. Yitzhak Rabin, Ehud Olmert, Ehud Barak, all prime ministers of Israel, and all used the A word. Even Ben-Gurion, a founder of political Zionism and the first prime minister of Israel, warned in 1967 that Israel was at risk of becoming an apartheid state. In a typically chilling statement invoking ethnic cleansing, he warned that if Israel didn't get rid of the territories and their Arab population as soon as possible, Israel would soon become an apartheid state. An unsurprisingly criminal statement from the guy who was the head of a paramilitary terrorist group, the Haganah, which helped establish the State of Israel and which later became the Israeli army, and he later became Israel's first prime minister. So, what about the international community? You may remember Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the United Nations. He went on a massive working tour of Israel and Palestine along with the head of UN human rights organizations, and he said that there was ever growing evidence that the situation meets the international legal definition of apartheid. That itself is hugely damning, but this has been echoed by many others within the UN, including the Special Rapporteur of Palestine. Famously, even Jimmy Carter, the former president of the US, said that Israel was inflicting apartheid on the Palestinians. I mean, he even wrote a book on the subject. The list is seemingly endless. There have been multiple people defining or warning Israel of apartheid. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, and you will notice that I haven't used a single Palestinian source or Arab quote. I have deliberately focused my sources to Israelis themselves or international organizations. But what I find most compelling is the work undertaken by human rights organizations. After all, these organizations' role is to campaign and advocate for the well-being of people in hardship. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, two of the biggest human rights organizations in the world, have both conducted years of extensive studies and field research on the subject, and they have both concluded that the threshold for apartheid is comfortably met. But most fascinating are Israel's very own human rights organizations. B'Tselem is one of Israel's biggest and most active human rights organizations. They published a brilliant report in 2021 which concluded that the bar for labeling the Israeli regime as apartheid has been met. Their chief at the time went on to say that Israel is not a democracy that has a temporary occupation attached to it. It is one regime between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and we must look at the full picture and see it for what it is: apartheid. Yesh Din is another of Israel's fantastic human rights organizations. In their report, they too found that Israeli treatment of the West Bank's Palestinian population meets the definition of the crime of apartheid under Article 7 of the 2002 Rome Statute. This, by the way, is the same legal statute that led to the establishment of the International Criminal Court. Both these Israeli organizations are clear this is apartheid. So, as you can see, labeling Israel an apartheid state is not merely the domain of the Arabs or Palestinians or those involved in the conflict with Israel. It is incredibly easy to establish the idea that there is consensus among rights groups and international organizations who have undertaken studies and research into this field. This goes beyond just my opinion or your opinion or the views of people on Twitter. This is about research and investigation and scholarship and academic analysis. Now, I think the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly the West Bank, is so clear cut and obvious that it is probably not worth debating whether it's apartheid or not. Here, Palestinians live under military law and live under occupation, whilst Israeli Jewish settlers live illegally in settlements under Israeli civilian law with access to roads and homes and areas exclusively for them. So, they have their own laws, their own roads, their own towns, their own security, and they have their own category of ID. It really is so clear cut. The International Court of Justice is currently deliberating over the legality of Israel's presence in these occupied territories, so I'll do a separate explainer video after that ruling. Today, though, I want to focus specifically on the state of Israel proper, which is where the debate on apartheid is most hotly contested and disputed. I want to highlight three key specific areas that I feel clearly demonstrate the systematic racial discrimination embedded deep in Israeli policy. These three areas are citizenship, freedom of movement and migration, and language. So let's start with citizenship. In Israel, approximately 20% of the population are Arab. Israel's basic law, that's effectively their constitution, explicitly states that self-determination is the exclusive right of the Jews. It's not a right that extends to Muslim Arabs or Christian Arabs or Bedouin Arabs or anyone else for that matter. The state extends this right only and exclusively to the Jewish majority and none of the minorities. This is enshrined in law. In addition to this, Israel defines itself officially as the Jewish state. It is not a state of its people. It is, by its own admission, the state of the Jews. Can you imagine South Africa declaring it is the state of the white people? Or the UK declaring it is the exclusive state of the English? Or the USA stating it was the state of the Christians? How would that reflect on black people in South Africa, or the Welsh, Scottish, and Northern Irish in the UK, or non Christians in the US? You may remember how, in the not too distant past, Germany declared itself the state of a very specific set of people. It's dangerous. There was an infamous and poignant incident where Israeli celebrity Rotem Seller asked, when will anyone in this government tell the public that this is the state of all its citizens? To which the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, replied, it isn't. It is a nation state of Jews alone. He couldn't have been more explicit. Ask yourself how this would make you feel as a citizen of Israel who wasn't Jewish. Would you feel that you were an equal citizen? There's also one more important bit of legislation to tell you of. If you reside in Israel and obtain citizenship, you are required by law to renounce any other nationality you hold. This in itself is not too problematic, as there are plenty of countries in the world that don't allow dual or multiple citizenship. Except for the fact that there is an exemption to this law in Israel. If you are Jewish, you are not required to renounce other nationalities. You can have as many nationalities as you wish. This law, therefore, fundamentally discriminates between Jews, the majority demographic, and all other minorities. I myself here in the UK am a dual national. Imagine if I was told that I, as an Arab Muslim Brit, had to renounce any other nationality I held, but that my white Christian friends and neighbours were allowed as many nationalities as they want. Is that equality? I mean, imagine if we said that men were allowed dual citizenship, but women were not. Wouldn't we call that misogyny? This leads us neatly into the issue of migration. In Israeli legislation, anyone from anywhere in the world, no matter what country, can migrate to Israel and obtain automatic citizenship if they can demonstrate their Jewishness. This person doesn't have to have any link to the region at all. They simply have to be Jewish, even if they converted to Judaism last week. Conversely, imagine for a moment you were Palestinian and your parents were buried within the borders of modern-day Israel or historic Palestine, and your grandparents were buried there, and your great-great-grandparents were buried there, and you yourself were displaced from that land in 1948, and you were registered by the United Nations as a refugee. You do not have a right to enter Israel, let alone get citizenship. So, someone with multi-generational ties to the land cannot get citizenship purely because they're Arab, and someone else who has never been to the land can claim citizenship, so long as they demonstrate they're Jewish. This policy ensures that Israel maintains a majority Jewish population, which is an objective that has been openly declared by Israel dating right back to the formation and foundation of Zionism. This is a form of demographic engineering, which is where a nation implements policy and legislation to closely control and influence the ethnic and religious makeup of that country. In fact, Israel openly calls the Arab community a demographic threat. This is the epitome of racial discrimination used as a tool of state policy. Another way of controlling the demographic makeup of a country is to control the rules of family unification. A Jewish person in Israel can marry anyone from anywhere around the world, and their spouse is immediately entitled to settlement and citizenship in Israel. Again, this isn't necessarily controversial because it's a law that exists in most countries, except for the fact that if you are an Arab Israeli and you marry someone from Palestinian territories, for example Gaza or the West Bank, you are not afforded this right. You are not extended the law of family unification, and your spouse is not allowed to settle with you in Israel. This law overwhelmingly discriminates against Arab Israelis, as they are the people most likely to marry a fellow Palestinian, most of whom reside in Gaza or the West Bank. To add insult to injury and to emphasize that this policy is fundamentally racist, if the spouse in question who lives in the West Bank happens to be a Jewish settler, then the family unification law applies. It couldn't be more overtly discriminatory. The makeup of a society can also be controlled by defining who can live where and by controlling who can own land and property. In law, it is illegal to sell Israeli property or land to anyone outside of Israel, unless, of course, they are Jewish, in which case property and land can be sold to anyone anywhere on the planet so long as they demonstrate that Jewishness. In addition to this, within Israel itself, some areas have committees which are tasked with maintaining the cultural makeup of the community. These committees, which do not contain Arabs within them, are made up of government and community representatives, as well as senior officials of big Israeli organizations such as Jewish Agency and the Zionist Organization, and have the authority to veto who can live within those communities. The cultural makeup that these committees are trying to protect and maintain is Jewishness. So, by extension, these committees are set up to bar Arab Israelis from moving into certain areas and to ensure these areas maintain a Jewish majority. This is reflected in the demographic spread across Israel. Arabs make up around 20% of the Israeli population, but they own and live in only 2.5% of the land. A particularly recent and gut-wrenching episode is the story of the Israeli Arabs of Ras Jaraba in the Negev desert south of Israel. In July of 2023, an Israeli court ordered 500 Israeli Bedouin Arabs to be forcibly evicted from their homes to make way for a new neighborhood for the city of Dimona, whose inhabitants are mostly Jewish Israelis. The evicted Arabs will be relocated to an impoverished and segregated Bedouin town nearby. The indigenous Arabs have until the end of March 2024 to leave. Amnesty International said this: "It highlights the deep discrimination that Palestinian citizens of Israel face under apartheid." It added that the clock is ticking for Ras Jaraba's residents who have to pack up their lives and leave the only homes they have ever known. Let's just reflect on these words for a moment. Displaced from the only homes they have ever known. This isn't the first time this has happened. Israel did the same when it ethnically cleansed and displaced 700,000 Palestinians from their homes in the Nakba of 1948, the formation of the State of Israel. There is a clear precedent for this. Similar stories can be found in Jerusalem and other parts of Israel today, where there is an aggressive drive to maintain a Jewish majority. This is a policy known as displace and replace, and is an absolute example of ethnic cleansing. This is reflected in Israeli state policy, which openly proclaims that, now listen to these words, the Jewish people have an exclusive and inalienable right to all parts of the land of Israel. An exclusive right. This demographic engineering project can be seen throughout the arc of history. In 1800, the Christian and Muslim Arab population was 97% in the region. By 1945, before the formation of the State of Israel, the Arab population was 70%. Today, the Arab population of Israel proper is only 20%. This is a comprehensive, deliberate, systematic, and often violent re engineering of the indigenous population of the region. Finally, and briefly, we end with language. Language is so important in a society because it forms the framework of human interaction and integration. It is so intricately associated with a nation's identity, and it tells the story of the cultures that make up a modern day nation state. After centuries of being the main language spoken, Israel has now downgraded the Arabic language, removing it as an official language of the state. And in doing so, it has established Hebrew as the only and exclusive official language. This is a deliberate step to devalue Arab culture in Israel and assert the domination of one ethnic religious group over another. Let's be clear. So many nations have multiple official languages, an example of which is Switzerland, which has four. This is what a nation does when it wants to embrace its diversity and all its cultures, not dominate one over the other. What Israel did in passing this law was effectively send a message to its Arab citizens. They are of less value than their Jewish neighbours. It is the very same message that would be sent if Switzerland tomorrow decided to downgrade the German language. Its native German speakers would understandably feel marginalised by what is entirely an unnecessary policy change. It has no practical function whatsoever. It is simply a symbolic policy of ethno supremacy. These are just a select few examples of how Israel legislates its racist policies to make them part of the fabric of how the nation is governed. This is by no means an exhaustive list. Any one of these can be seen to meet the threshold set out by Article 2 of the Apartheid Convention. There is a great resource called adala.org which catalogues the racist laws which establish these policies in practice in Israel. And of course, the reports by B'Tselem, Yesh Din, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch are all on the public domain. Let's be clear. Calling Israel an apartheid state is not simply some kind of political point scoring. It is important to fully diagnose and acknowledge what is being done to the Palestinians, and to also remember that so many remained silent and even supported South African apartheid when it was happening. And we must remember that the term never again applies to all historic atrocities. Once upon a time, the UK designated Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. It imprisoned him and it supported apartheid South Africa. Those who were brave enough to speak out and oppose it and make a stand against it were attacked. Today, a statue of Nelson Mandela stands proudly in almost every major city in the world, including the capital of the UK, where we look back in shame on how we stood on the wrong side of history. Recognizing apartheid where apartheid exists is important to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. It is not enough to point at other countries and say, well, what about them? They're an apartheid too. This is typical whataboutery, and it does little to present a solid argument in defense of Israel. It just shows that Israel is as bad or worse than other despotic regimes around the world that subjugate their people. When making your own conclusions, consider this. The perpetrators of a crime and their cheerleaders will always deny their atrocities, so you will have to appraise the information you've heard today and decide who to believe. Those on one side who stand accused of these crimes, or on the other side, the many international and Israeli human rights organizations whose sole existence is to help people who are suffering. Which side of history will you be on?